Well, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, our common humanity, bonsoir. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm afraid after those two excellent speeches, I'm afraid I can be nothing more than a disappointment to you, but I will try to add something to the discussion that we've been having this evening. We'll cover some of the same ground, but hopefully enough to keep it interesting. I'm going to give not just the case against euthanasia-assisted suicide, we don't have the time for the comprehensive case, but I hope to give at least some powerful points. Now, I'm going to remind us what euthanasia and assisted suicide are. I'm going to interrogate the purported reasons for the introduction of those practices into Jersey law and practice. I'm going to explore the reason for the law as it exists and actually how later it could be better. I'm going to discuss whether euthanasia and assisted suicide truly fulfills the purposes it is meant to fulfill. And then I'm going to propose truly progressive alternatives to euthanasia and assisted suicide. Just to remind us, euthanasia and suicide are different. Euthanasia is the active, intentional termination of a patient's life by a doctor who thinks that death is the benefit to that patient. That's actually the definition of the UK NHS. I don't know why they have that on their website, but that's what they have. And assisted suicide should be understood as the fact that a doctor intentionally assists another person to commit suicide, provides another person with the means to that end on the express and voluntary request of that person. That's the definition from Luxembourg's law on euthanasia-assisted suicide from 2009. Now, there are two reasons that are given for the legalization or the introduction of euthanasia-assisted suicide into law and medical practice. The first, and perhaps the most compelling to my mind, is the issue of dignity. Hence, we have the phrase dignity in dying in the UK by the leading organisation for that practice. The ostensible reason for having euthanasia-assisted suicide is to alleviate physical suffering and pain, or to alleviate existential suffering. There are some, in fact, many more people who are not suffering pain as much as they are suffering the loss of their ability to do the things they used to do and loved. In fact, when we look at Oregon, not even in the top 5 reasons is physical pain actually given, or in fact not even physical pain, but the worry, the concern about physical pain, actually given as a reason. But existential suffering, such as loss of autonomy, truly is. That's more the leading reason. Now, euthanasia and assisted suicide are not necessary to deal with pain. That is a myth that is propagated. It's a very unfortunate one. No one is allergic to literally every drug, every antiemetic, every analgesic and the like used in palliative care. This I am told by those who are much more expert than me in palliative care. Where people have painful deaths, and they do exist, I'm not denying that, it is because they lack access to appropriate care. The answer is to make sure that palliative specialist practice is available to every single patient who needs it. We're not there in the United Kingdom, despite the fact that we have arguably the best and most extensive palliative care system, thanks to Dame Cicely Saunders and the early hospice movement, in the world. Jersey isn't there yet either. No jurisdiction is. And until we have achieved that, it would be quite wrong to try to introduce assisted suicide and euthanasia. After all, where there are people who do not have access to palliative care, where they do not have proper access to palliation, by offering them euthanasia and assisted suicide, it will be a reason to push them into an early death, into a premature death. That is not what a civilized society should want. Physical pain is never necessarily the issue. And where it is an issue, palliative care is the true answer. But existential suffering is often a problem. One can't stop by removal of pain someone's existential pain, someone's pain of the fact that they do not have the ability to do what they once loved to do. And perhaps the hardest of hard cases for euthanasia are those who have what's called locked-in syndrome. People, in other words, who are paraplegic, people who have motor neurone syndrome, people who have lost the ability to move. They are literally only a mind and a body which they cannot control. They're paralyzed. Those are, I think all of us would imagine being in such a situation, find it very hard to think as to how that could possibly be any kind of life that could be called one of flourishing or of happiness. And yet, there are stories like Michael Kupis. In 2012, the BBC interviewed a chap called Michael Kupis, who does have locked-in syndrome, who despite his paralysis and his inability even to talk, was described by his wife as amazingly happy. And many other people who they've been able to communicate with, due to the technology that has been developed for that, whose illness was so debilitating they couldn't even move their eyes, found that 7 out of 10 occasions the patients reported being happy. And this has been supported by the evidence supplied by a study reported in 2011 in which many people with locked-in syndrome described themselves as being, again, happy. Why was this? It was because despite the fact they couldn't do what they once used to do and love to do, play sports, go for walks, read, things like that, well, actually they can read through other kinds of means, but do those kinds of physical activities, nonetheless, they were cared for, they had loving family, and that was the source of their happiness. So to say that existential suffering is completely hopeless and suggest that because someone is locked in or disabled in that sense, they cannot be happy, they cannot achieve flourishing, is actually just incredibly ableist. And that should be very concerning. If the power of the argument from dignity lies in the general perception that people in such situations as MS or paraplegia must want euthanasia, that is very ableist and, in fact, demonstrably incorrect. Now, another reason why I think the dignity argument is hugely problematic, apart from that I think it fails on the fact, is that actually the opposite is true. Euthanasia-assisted suicide can often cause, rather than prevent, painful deaths. The latest annual statistical report from Oregon reports that between 1997 and 2020, 68.8% of the lethal drugs that were used in Oregon had been barbiturates, such as secabarbital, phenobarbital, and pentobarbital. Now, this is the same means by which criminals on death row in the US are killed in lethal injection executions. It works by inducing unconsciousness, followed by respiratory arrest and consequent asphyxiation. And this has been called cruel and unusual by members of the US Supreme Court due to testimony that's been brought before the court. The majority of those injected with pentobarbital suffered flash pulmonary edema, that is to say they felt like they were drowning, in other words, fluid was filling up in their lungs, which can lead to a sensation akin to drowning and extreme pain, terror, and panic. Now, why is this relevant to assisted suicide and euthanasia? Well, a particular Canadian physician called Dr. Joel Zivot, who was a campaigner against these kinds of executions in capital punishment, who has acted as an expert witness against the use of lethal injection, described the autopsy of one death row inmate killed by pentobarbital lethal injection, Marcus Willens, which revealed, quote, that his lungs were profoundly congested with fluid, meaning that they were around twice the normal weight of healthy lungs. Willens had drowned in his own secretions. Drowning in this manner is both prolonged and painful. And he concluded that he is, quote, quite certain that assisted suicide, the same could be true of euthanasia, where pentobarbital and other forms of barbiturates are used, is not painless or peaceful or dignified. In fact, in the majority of cases, he says, it is a very painful death, and that advocates of euthanasia-assisted suicide owe a duty to the public to be truthful about the details of killing and dying. People who want to die deserve to know that they may end up drowning, not just falling asleep. And you might say, well, okay, don't use barbiturates. Use other kinds of drugs that will achieve the same kind of results, but without these problems. But they've tried that in America. The reason why they've tried that is because barbiturates have become increasingly difficult to get. The reason for that being drugs companies, worried about lethal injection executions, have restricted the supply. What they've also done, actually, is price gouged, so that barbiturates that used to be worth $300 are now something like $1,500. They've really, really profited from that. But because of that, doctors who have been using assisted suicide in America have tried to find alternatives. So they tried cheaper drug cocktails to bring about assisted suicide, such as a mixture of phenobarbital, chlorohydrate, and morphine sulfate, which were cheap and easily accessible. The problem is this caused, quote, profound burning in the mouths of patients, so they had to try again. They tried a mixture of diazepam, digoxin, morphine, and propranolol, DDMP. This was developed. But the journalist Anita Hanig, whose article on this, which is extremely concerning, I really do recommend to you to read, reports that after the first 30 deaths, the group increased the individual doses and named the new formula DDMP2, which cost around $750. On average, patients who ingested DDMP2 took much longer to die than those who could still afford Seconal. Until the end of 2019, the mean time to death for DDMP2 was over 4 hours in Oregon. One death lasted as long as 47 hours. But Seconal had moved out of reach for many. And in 2018, fewer and fewer pharmacies were stocking it, knowing that the current batch was set to expire by the end of the year. And since then, it's become unavailable, forcing physicians across the country to rely exclusively on DDMP2. According to Hanning again, when this was refined, they decided to change one drug with another, an antidepressant that can cause a fatal change in heart rhythm in high doses. Quote, with this change, 90% of patients have died in under 2 hours. And that's long enough, I would have thought, to be very concerned about someone's death. But she describes a particular man by the pseudonym of Jeff, who was an Oregonian man in his late 50s, who was suffering kidney failure. And this is as related by his social worker, Ada, again, a pseudonym for her article. This ended. Jeff drank the lethal cocktail through a straw. It's kind of what happens in Switzerland as well, incidentally. Within 20 minutes, he was asleep. 12 hours later, Ada saw a shadow out of the corner of her eye and looked over. Jeff was sitting up and awake. Then he started vomiting profusely. After he awoke, scared and confused, Jeff was admitted to the hospital. When Ada visited Jeff the next day, she found him in the comfort care ward. Nurses had given him a mild tranquilizer to help with his nausea and vomiting. Over the next 4 days, he declined rapidly. Ada was with Jeff when he died. As he lay flailing in his hospital bed, yanking at the sheets, she held his hand. He didn't die peacefully, she said, her voice almost breaking. It was a terrible death. So the argument from Dignity is not, I would suggest, a sound one. And unless you know the drugs that would be used to impose provide euthanasia and assisted suicide in Jersey, I would be very, very skeptical in terms of introducing that practice here. But there's another argument. The argument more popularly used is autonomy, the so-called right to die, or choice. Hence the group, my death, my decision. Again, this is a very understandable argument. I think we can all empathize with those who, imagining themselves to be in a situation where, again, they'd lost their autonomy, that is to say they'd lost their ability to do things, would want to have an end to that experience. Someone put it on social media recently, I would welcome the unhindered choice to end my days. But I think this is wrongly classed as an argument for a kind of freedom. It's not a freedom at all. At the moment, even though, incidentally, Jersey is the one actual jurisdiction within the British Isles which still has a customary law crime of suicide, it is still, strictly speaking, illegal to try to commit suicide. And I would, by the way, argue that you should, we'll talk about that later, repeal that law, suppress that law, because I think it's actually quite disedifying for those who are mentally ill. Nonetheless, that hasn't been applied anywhere in the courts in this particular jurisdiction for over 100 years. So you have a practical legal liberty to try to commit suicide, and if you fail, the state will not criminalize you. So if you have the legal liberty, you already have the legal freedom to commit suicide. This is not arguing for a freedom. This is arguing for someone to help you commit suicide or else to kill you on your behalf. That's euthanasia. So this isn't a freedom, this is an entitlement to someone giving you the ability to do something you want to do. That is not a freedom, it's an entitlement. But even if it were a right, even if it were a freedom, like the freedom of speech, it would be irrationally applied to euthanasia and assisted suicide. Why? Because autonomy is limited according to the effect that your actions have, not only on others, directly or indirectly, not only but they have on society more generally, us as a community, but also the effect they have on you. The idea that we live as islands in and of themselves, in ourselves, is nonsense. So let's use a few examples to this. The direct effects on others. My right to move my hand through the air stops when it reaches your face. If it reached Gordon's face, he's Scottish, he'd make me very well aware of the limits of my autonomy, let me tell you. My right to shout at the top of my lungs is limited according to the effect it would have on my neighbours. Autonomy is not absolute in those areas. Another example, actually, that Gordon used earlier on is the example of antibiotics. If you go to a doctor with a common cold and you say, I want antibiotics, he will probably, or she will probably say, no. Why? Because even though you are autonomously trying to gain this particular medical device, the effect of overuse of antibiotics means that antibiotics become less and less and less effective. And who does that affect most badly? It affects the most vulnerable members of the community, because those who are the most sick, those who most need antibiotics, are going to be badly, even worse affected than the rest of us by the decreasing efficacy of those kinds of drugs. So in other words, your doctor will say no to you. Your autonomy will be blocked. He will be denied because the effect it has on the community, on society, and particularly on the most vulnerable members of our society. But more radical examples also prove this point. If you suffered from bodily identity dysphoria, that is to say, those small number of people who do not any longer identify with a limb, a healthy limb, such they go to a doctor and say, look, I don't want this leg anymore. It's a healthy limb, but I don't want this leg anymore. I want you to amputate. The doctor ethically would have to say no. Why? Because it's not in your best interests for him or her to do that. If he or she said yes, at the very least, they would be struck off the Jersey Medical Register. Actually, more likely, they would be prosecuted under the customary law offence of grave and criminal assault, and quite rightly so. If you jumped off a bridge in order to drown yourself and someone else rescued you, what would be the response to that person? The response would be, well done you for saving that person's life. It would not be, you terrible person, you denied their autonomy. They wanted to commit suicide, but you blocked their autonomy. We recognise that when it comes to our lives, when it comes to our limbs, our autonomy is limited because of the effect it has on us. So autonomy is limited. And to give you the most extreme example, and I'm not, by the way, before someone says, oh, you're comparing this to assisted suicide or a euthanasia. No, I'm not. I'm using this to bring you to the fullness of the principle of autonomy and why it doesn't work. This is the case, the Maives-Brandes case in Germany. I don't know if you've heard about this. This was the early 2000s. Bernd Jürgen Brandes was a 43-year-old German man who in 2001 answered the online advertisement of another man, 42-year-old Armin Maives, for a, quote, well-built male prepared to be slaughtered and then consumed. This was the cannibal case. Brandes went to Maives' home, where Maives proceeded to kill and eat Brandes for their mutual sexual gratification. And Brandes consented entirely voluntarily to his own demise. This was an act of autonomy. This was an act of total freedom on both their parts. And yet Maives, who was a psychopath, was rightly prosecuted by the German state and is still in prison. So again, autonomy, going right to the extreme example, is limited according to the effect it has on others, on the community, because I think legalising cannibalism would have some very nasty effects, and on the individuals themselves. Autonomy cannot be used as an absolute principle in any respect, from the very most minor examples to the most extreme. So having established that those two arguments, the two arguments most often used for assisted suicide and euthanasia, don't really work, let's also look then at what the purposes are for the law as we have it. In other words, those laws that prevent euthanasia and assisted suicide, either implicitly or even explicitly. In Jersey, it's actually implicitly, because you don't have a law explicitly banning assisting suicide. You do have laws against euthanasia by virtue of laws against murder, and you do have laws against assisted suicide, arguably due to the law against aiding and abetting murder itself, but that's not nearly as explicit as the laws elsewhere within the British Isles. But the laws do prevent those two practices. That's why we're having this debate. So Chesterton, GK Chesterton, who was an English writer, was quoted in a notebook by John F. Kennedy in 1945 in writing, "Don't ever take a fence down until you know the reason why it was put up." So in other words, if you're going to take away a law, if you're going to remove a restriction, you should be able to say why it was there in the first place and why, therefore, you are justified in taking it down. So why does the fence of laws against physician involvement in killing or enabling the suicide of patients exist? Well, the answer to that has been given to us by the European Court of Human Rights. Jersey is signatory to the European Convention, and individuals here may pursue rights claims under the Human Rights Jersey Law 2000. So this applies very much in this jurisdiction as it does elsewhere. And the European Court of Human Rights has defined in its guide to Article 2, which is the right to life, that the Article 2 of the Convention implies in certain well-defined circumstances, quote, a positive obligation on the authorities to take preventive operational measures to protect an individual whose life is at risk from the criminal acts of another individual. Not only, it argued, are suicide prevention strategies an important part of that obligation, but so are laws against assisting someone in causing their own death. This has actually been reasserted in the case a few years ago in Pretty versus the United Kingdom. Diane Pretty was someone who had motor neuron disease. She wanted to prosecute or sue the United Kingdom government for not allowing her to engage in that or to get her own death. And the European Court of Human Rights decided against her, saying that Article 2 enjoins states not only to refrain from the intentional and unlawful taking of life, but also to take appropriate steps to safeguard the lives of those within its jurisdiction, including a positive obligation on the authorities to take preventive operational measures to protect an individual whose life is at risk from the criminal acts of another individual. This is where this comes from. They also noted that Article 2 could not, without a distortion of language, be interpreted as conferring the diametrically opposite right, which is a right to die. And they said that nor could it create a right to self-determination in the sense of conferring on an individual the entitlement to choose death rather than life. They moved to Article 8, which is the right to respect for privacy and family life. This was another principle that was being advocated or appealed to by Diane Pretty. It said that in accordance with the law and necessary in a democratic society, is it for the state to interfere with private activity for, amongst other things, public safety, the prevention of disorder or crime, the protection of health, and the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. Such interference was thought necessary in its ends and proportional in its means. And it also said that states were entitled to regulate through the operation of criminal law activities that were detrimental to the life and safety of other individuals, including the law, in this case against assisted suicide, designed to safeguard life by protecting the weak and the vulnerable, and especially those who are not in a condition to take uninformed decisions against acts intended to end life or to assist in ending life. Public safety, the rights of others, these laws have purposes in protecting the most vulnerable members of our community. And so what we can say about the law, the reason why this law against euthanasia on the one hand and assisted suicide on the other exists, are for three purposes. It has a legal purpose in protecting vulnerable people from lethal coercion, a cultural purpose in affirming the value of human lives and the normal wrongness of killing, and a social purpose in safeguarding mental health by suicide prevention. So, having established those facts, let us ask ourselves, does euthanasia and assisted suicide really serve the two principles that it is advocated for, autonomy and dignity, let alone the purpose of the law as we've just described it? Well, I will argue it does not, and it not only destroys important legal protections, but in doing so it undermines genuine patient autonomy and dignity, and we see this both in theory as well as in practice. So, with the theory, let's go to the proposition that exists before the States Assembly. It argues that we should have euthanasia-assisted suicide in the cases where someone is diagnosed with a terminal illness which is expected to result in, quote, unbearable suffering that cannot be alleviated and is reasonably expected to die within 6 months. That's for people who are terminally ill. Or someone has an incurable physical condition resulting in, again, unbearable suffering that cannot be alleviated. Now, this would involve, as it says in the text, both euthanasia, necessarily for some conditions, and assisted suicide itself. So what would this include? Practical cases, brass tacks. Who would this include? Well, it actually covers a range of common incurable chronic illnesses and physical impairments, that is to say disabilities, which can be kept at bay or managed for years by effective treatment and social support and involve long and happy lives for those experiencing them. And that includes long COVID-19, diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome, Down's syndrome, asthma, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, which are in fact physical conditions. The genesis of this mental problem is actually a physical one. All of these are incurable physical conditions. They result in what could be called unbearable suffering that cannot be alleviated, because after all, what is bearable for you may not be bearable for someone else. Someone could very easily say that whatever they're experiencing within their own selves is unbearable due to these conditions, and it would allow for those persons to be subject to euthanasia. Other examples would be osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bone disease. The reason I choose that is because this is Lord Shinkwin. He's a peer, a Conservative peer in the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. He's a disability rights activist. He actually campaigns against assisted suicide, amongst other things, and he would be directly affected by this. If you've ever seen someone like that, they really struggle with that condition. It is not easy to deal with. But hero that he is, he does every single day. It would include inflammatory bowel disease, any kind of cancer, hypertension, heart disease, including those that simply cause arrhythmias, chronic obstructive respiratory disease. The list goes on and on. There are so many people who have simply chronic, not terminal illnesses necessarily, but chronic illnesses and disabilities who would be affected. And it would go on to affect those who are not merely physically ill, but mentally ill, because physical conditions cause mental effects. The citizens' jury members earlier on this year were asked if they chose unbearable suffering, could this include suffering caused by a mental condition? And this was the one thing that they denied, to my remembrance. This is the one area that they said, no, we're not actually going to go there. 14 said no, 9 said yes. It was more or less 60-40. But if we have a right to die, as the people who advocate for euthanasia-assisted suicide argue, why would you limit it to this cohort of suffering people, but not this cohort of suffering people? If dignity is truly the principle here, why would you say dignity is okay for all these, but not for these people over here? It doesn't make rational sense. Once you set the precedent of medicalised killing, there are no rational grounds to limit it. An example is Canada. Canada, as we've heard, within 5 years, having said no to euthanasia for those who have mental illness, then legalised it for people with mental illness. Within 5 years. And we see this precisely, this principle, in the two jurisdictions which have practiced euthanasia for the longest, which are Belgium and the Netherlands. This is Tina Nick, she's the lady in the middle. These two on the side are her two sisters. She was depressed after the breakup of her relationship. She had suffered domestic abuse. She had worked in prostitution. This is a woman who was seriously abused throughout her life. She was euthanized in 2009 on the basis that she had autism. Her parents and two sisters succeeded after 9 years of effort in having charges of unlawful poisoning laid against the psychiatrist and the two doctors who actually had certified her euthanasia. But despite the evidence that one of the doctors had fraudulently obtained the certification, all three were acquitted in 2020 last year. And a new trial against the doctor who committed the fraud is ongoing. This is Godelieve de Troyes, an otherwise healthy Belgian woman. She had depression. She was killed by lethal injection at her own request in a Brussels hospital in 2012, despite at least 2 of the experts who assessed her not agreeing that she was beyond treatment. If she was in the UK or here, she would be given the mental health care that she needs. In Belgium, she was euthanized. Her son, Tom Mortier, was not contacted about this until after his mother had been euthanized and the hospital rang him up asking him to retrieve her body from the morgue. He's currently pursuing legal action to the European Court of Human Rights, alleging that the Belgian state failed in its, again, positive obligation under Article 2, the right to life, to protect people from exactly this kind of pressure. Mark and Eddie Verberson, two deaf twins, were euthanized in 2013 due to the fear that with the onset of blindness they'd be unable to communicate with each other. They hadn't even become blind yet. It was simply the fear of blindness that led them to be euthanized. Nathan Verhelst, born Nancy, euthanized in 2013 after a series of failed gender reassignment surgeries. This person could not accept their condition. Angie, a Dutch woman who asked for euthanasia for psychological pain in 2016 after being sexually exploited by her psychiatrist who was treating her for anorexia. Mark Langedijk, who's a Dutch man who was an alcoholic, ended his life in 2016 by fatal injection because he couldn't accept his condition of alcoholism. An unnamed Dutch woman in her 20s who had suffered sexual abuse from the age of 5 to 15 and suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and chronic depression, was euthanized in 2016, and doctors judged her to be completely competent, totally competent, that there was no major depression or other mood disorder which affected her thinking. Aurelia Brouwers, 29, she committed assisted suicide in the Netherlands in 2018 because of psychiatric suffering, and she said, "When I was 12, I suffered from depression. When I was first diagnosed, they told me I had borderline personality disorder. Other diagnoses followed: attachment disorder, chronic depression. I'm chronically suicidal. I have anxiety, psychoses, and I hear voices." And the BBC report in her case mentions another woman, Monique Arend, who suffered from serious mental health issues, again, after sexual abuse. And on and on and on it goes. There are so many cases, and we don't have the time to deal with all of them, sadly. But just 3 more might give you an example of where it could have happened and hasn't yet. Frank Vandenblieken was a serial rapist and murderer, and he was meant to be euthanized in prison in 2015 because he couldn't accept the psychological suffering of being in prison, because that's kind of the point. And it was only at the last minute they said, no, we're not going to go there. Sebastien, a 39-year-old man in Belgium, again, this is a pseudonym, tried to end his life in 2016 because he couldn't accept his sexuality. He said of euthanasia, for me, it's just a kind of euthanasia. And Emily, who went under the pseudonym Laura, said, life, that's not for me. She simply suffered from ennui. And she could have committed suicide. She could have had euthanasia, but for the fact that she changed her mind at the last moment. So as we see, the abuse of those who are seriously mentally ill goes on anyway. So you might say, okay, all of these problems are to do with euthanasia. Why not limit it? Why not say, okay, euthanasia is clearly a problem. Why not use assisted suicide alone? Why not reduce the proposition just to those elements that are to do with the terminally ill and to assisted suicide? Hey, it works in Oregon. That's something we continually hear. It works in Oregon. Because Dignity in Dying has claimed that in Oregon there have been no cases of abuse of the law and no widening of its initial limited scope. Well, unfortunately, that's just not true. Thomas Middleton was a man suffering from motor neuron disease in 2008. He moved into the house of a friend, Tammy Sawyer, before procuring an assisted suicide, and 2 days later, Sawyer placed his home on the market and transferred $200,000 to her account after he died. Sawyer and her husband were later indicted for first-degree criminal mistreatment and first-degree aggravated theft. Furthermore, Oregon have changed the law to forego the 15-day waiting period, which has been proposed for Jersey. They're also considering whether to repeal the eligibility limitation to Oregon residents only, which has been proposed for Jersey. Irrespective of all this, we know very little about Oregon, but what we do know is extremely concerning. We know that in its first year of the Death with Dignity report, it's admitted that we cannot detect or collect data on issues of non-compliance with any accuracy, with other reports admitting that our numbers are based on a reporting system for terminally ill patients who legally receive prescriptions for lethal medications and do not include patients and physicians who may act outside the law. In other words, it functions as minimal data collection. There's no strong oversight of assisted suicide exercised by the state government. There's no scanning of non-compliance or underreporting or anything like that. There's no punishment for those who do not report, who underreport, anything like that. It is simply minimal data collection. And all the information that is collected is entirely voluntary. An editorial in the Oregonian pointed out the law establishes a system that seems rigged to avoid finding abuses. And there may be other abuses in Canada, but we wouldn't know about them. So I think that I need to draw to a close now, ladies and gentlemen, because we've gone on quite a while. So I'll simply point out that assisted suicide has led to serious mental health, serious abuse of people with mental health. We had a 2008 British Medical Journal, which examined 58 Oregonians who sought information on assisted suicide. Of these, over a quarter met the criteria for depressive disorder and over a fifth for anxiety disorder. And the study's authors concluded that Oregon's law may not adequately protect all mentally ill patients. There's been suicide contagion, alleged by a 2015 study by Jones and Payton, which examined the association between the license of assisted suicide in individual American states and suicide rates. And this found that this was associated with a 6.3 increase in total suicides. So these are the levels of assisted suicide increasing over time, including euthanasia. Just by the way, combined PEPS, that means both euthanasia and assisted suicide. That indicates where someone has tried to commit suicide by assisted suicide and they've botched it. So the doctor has had to come along and finish them off, which goes to the point about pain I described earlier. I think that we can argue that assisted suicide undermines autonomy. I think that we can see patient instrumentalization because 23.5% of all lung donors in Belgium had been euthanized, which raises concerns that they had been basically told, you've had a good innings, why don't we do one last good act and actually retrieve your organs. And I would point out that if you want to say that, well, this couldn't happen here, we would have safeguards. Well, look, the safeguards that have been proposed, the idea that it would only be permitted with the direct assistance of registered medical practitioners, that would be subject to a mandatory period of reflection, withdrawal of requests would be permitted at any time, would only be permitted in pre-approved locations. All of these things that are mentioned within the proposition have all been tried elsewhere and they have failed. Nowhere do these proposals set out how anyone might go about evaluating a patient to discern that they're not acting under duress. The UK's Royal College of Psychiatrists advised in 2006 that many doctors do not recognise depression or know how to assess for its presence in terminally ill patients. The two-doctor certification system has happened elsewhere and it simply hasn't stopped from abuses from taking place. These are paper safeguards. And even a psychiatrist would not have the period of time to properly see that someone's autonomy had been truly undermined. And a court, a tribunal, oversighting all of this would do nothing. If the procedure itself is weak, and it is, if it's paper safeguards, their overseeing that it's happened makes zero difference to whether or not it protects people. So I'd simply conclude by saying that there are true answers to the problems that have been raised about autonomy and about dignity and about all these things. What we should see is the destigmatization of Jersey law. As I say, we have a customary law in Jersey which, unlike all the other countries in the British Isles, you still haven't abolished that particular customary law, which existed in almost all jurisdictions, apart from Scotland, which actually criminalised suicide. That's still on the books, effectively. If you got rid of that, if you removed it, that would destigmatise poor mental health. That is a progressive move that could happen. At the same time, you could introduce the same criminalisation of assisting suicide that exists in Guernsey and in Ireland and in Britain and elsewhere. And you could also engage in the extension of access to specialist palliative care, which, of course, next year you will be really looking into due to the integrated care pathway which is being introduced. That would be a really progressive move as well. But until those things are done, how can you possibly argue for a system that would endanger the lives of the most vulnerable members of your society? So in conclusion, I think we can see that euthanasia-assisted suicide undermines rather than serves both dignity and autonomy. I think we can see that it undermines the purpose of the law in terms of affirming the value of the lives of human beings, protecting the vulnerable, and supporting suicide prevention. And instead of introducing medicalised killing, Jersey should destigmatise law relating to suicide, strengthen legal protections, enhance access to palliative care, and in doing so, it will stand for the right to life and the dignity of all human beings and the welfare of the vulnerable. Merci bien.